Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome back to The Eurofile. September is here. We are back to school. First, we'll discuss the formation of a new French government after Macron picked former chief Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier as prime minister. Then we'll briefly discuss two regional elections in East Germany and the outline of Ursula von der Leyen's new European Commission, which should be decided very soon. And by the time this podcast comes out, we should have her proposed lineup. And then we'll turn to a conversation with Federico Steinberg, visiting fellow with the CSIS Europe Russia-Eurasia program and senior analyst at Elcano, about the long-awaited Draghi report on the European Union's competitiveness. We hope you enjoy the show. Max, how's your summer been?
It's over. I went to Europe's version of Maine, i.e. Sweden. It was quite wonderful. We've come back from vacation. We played on our softball team this week where we have an annual CSIS competition where it's the geezers versus the whippersnappers. And Donatien and I are both on the geezers. And
That's
Donatien,
correct.
as a new American citizen, is played the whole game, and the geezers won. So
It was required for my citizenship, actually.
yeah, to play softball. You may not know this, Europeans, but you actually have to learn the rules of baseball. Softball is basically a version of baseball. But over the summer, a lot was happening in French politics that I had a hard time following and understanding. Now, you went to Belgium, right?
Yes.
So you're close enough. So what was going on? How was your summer?
Well, my summer was good. During the French election, I was in Tunisia, so I was on basically the right time zone to be watching the debates on TV in between the two rounds. It was pandemonium on TV sets with the pundits. And last time I did go to Belgium, we were just waiting. After the results of the election, we waited until now 51 days for Macron to appoint a new prime minister. And let's just say people are not super happy with this results.
The
now,
French
we should
are not
say
happy?
the French are often unhappy. However, the core issue at hand here is that Macron appointed Michel Barnier, who hails from Les Républicains. This is only the fifth largest party in parliament coming out of the elections in July, which means...
In the former historic center-right party.
Correct, which
that
is
has
now
been
quite
diminished.
right-wing. And Barnier himself, who had run in the Républicain presidential primary a few years ago, is pretty right-wing on immigration, on the economy, and a series of issues like this, when we know that the left-wing coalition got the most votes, not per each party inside of it, but overall. And we also know that a lot of left-wing voters held their nose, as they say, to vote for a right-wing party if it meant keeping the far right's Rassemblement National outside of seats in the parliament. So overall, I think for a lot of people on the left and in the center, feels like a slap in the face. ELAB has a survey out very recently that shows that 74% of people polled think that Macron disregarded the results of the election. 74%, that's not nothing. 55% believe it was stolen. I think we've all heard this discourse before. None of this is good for democracy. And Macron has just waited and waited to appoint somebody that he thought would be more palatable to himself and probably to maintain, or let's be honest, I think to keep alive some of the reforms that he passed on pensions, for example.
Isn't Macron's defense here that the left was also really uncompromising as well and basically came forth and said that they had won the election, which you could argue they did, but it was still sort of one-third, 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 and weren't really making the compromises necessary that you would have to sort of put together a coalition. And maybe Macron wasn't receptive, but that's a criticism of the left that I've seen. What do you think about that?
That's, of course, going to be Macron's defense, is that they were not compromising enough. However, they all agreed on a couple different names that he rejected each time because he didn't want anybody from Mélenchon's party to be prime minister. So I don't know that this holds that much, to be perfectly honest, and he waited and waited. I think you can also argue that he picked someone who would be palatable to the far right. And they have said, we will abstain from the vote. Basically, we'll let him go through, Barnier. And each time we have to make a decision on an important law, probably they'll try to extract some kind of concession. So he has presented this big election as a way to keep the far right out of power Yet he engineered a situation with a prime minister who is closer to them in policy positions than anyone else the left could have put forward. So the argument that he's putting, I just think there's a little bit of, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, the decisions that he's been making. And I think that's a sign that he probably feels a little desperate politically at this point, trying to retain as much power as he can while still admitting that he's going to need the prime minister to have a good chunk of power now too.
Now, I've seen that there's some talk that this may not last, that there may be a total political deadlock, and the only thing that would really resolve it is if Macron were to actually resign. I sort of doubt that will happen, but to me, one of the major questions is, what does this mean for, future French presidential elections? What does this mean for a Le Pen candidacy? Because I think the major outlier here, or major problem or concern, especially for Europe or for the United States, is if Le Pen could really come to office. And the only way I actually now see that possible is if you have a really fractured political landscape where the two top political parties are from the far right and the far left. And so if it's Le Pen and Mélenchon, and I think the danger of what Macron has done is the center too fractured to actually figure out and have like a single candidate. But the left then is energized. Mélenchon gets from like 20% to like 25% maybe in the next first round. And maybe that's where, Le Pen is as well. And you kind of have the center sort of all fractured. Then you're having an anti-establishment party win the next presidential election. Because I think if it's either one of those and someone from one of the center left or, to the center right spectrum, which is rather large, then I think you have a situation where that's the person most likely to win.
No, I think that makes sense. But I also, in addition to having fractured the center, I think Macron's challenge is he has also diluted the meaning of center. For a lot of French voters, the only way they find a real contrast in policy positions now is by going to the far left or by going to the far right. And everything in the middle, because Macron collated all of these positions in his first government, because his original party, when he came on the scene in 2017, was a combination of socialists, of center-right, and some right-wing people all coming together. You create this big blob that to people no longer represents the political center, it just represents Macron. And they don't really know what that means politically anymore. So they'll go to the wings of that and to the extremes of the spectrum. I'll just add one last thing, which is, you say Le Pen, I don't know that in 2027 it's her. Jordan Bardella has done a ton of work to make the party more palatable, especially to a lot of younger people. And I think if you get to that, it might be him. I mean, he's facing some investigation around fake jobs in the European Parliament, which seems to be a brand for the Rassemblement National. But I think that's something to consider as well, which will be another blow to the center, because this is a very young, energetic person who can present a new vision of that party. And it's not looking great, I think, for Macron at the moment.
I think that's a good segue to talk about...
To go from another depressing topic.
One basket case to another basket case, which just so happens to be the two biggest countries in Europe.
Yeah, everything's fine.
Everything's fine. German regional elections. What happened?
Those two regional elections, one in Thuringia, the other one in Saxony, which in eastern Germany, saw the AfD, which is the far-right party, get its best results ever. And the best result of far-right party in Germany has won since World War II. Obviously, this brings together very concerning and painful memories, not just in Germany, to be honest, across Europe as well. I think if my grandmother saw these results, she would be really, really concerned as well. But basically, AfD won over 30% of the vote in Thuringia and just about 31% or so in Saxony. And this is just a concerning result, let's say. Not entirely surprising. The polls were not that wrong. We could see the AfD rising there. And it's been growing for the last few years as well. It's just the problem is the political ramifications that creates and what that means for political stability at the federal level in Germany as well.
On the one hand, I think we can sort of overread these elections because there are two states, particularly Thuringia is quite small, but there are two states in eastern Germany, which is where the AfD does the best. So that it's not necessarily portending, the AfD to kind of win national elections. I think that's something, first of all, people should understand. This is a bit like having an election in the American South and then trying to project out nationwide what it would mean. That said, I think it sort of further demonstrates that the political suicide pact that is this German coalition is a huge problem. And when I look ahead at the German elections next year, I think the basic political problem, and this in some ways I think is also reflected in France and Macron, where Macron sort of occupied the center, and so the only way to have an opposition is on the far right and far left. There are basically four political parties in Germany that have been governing over the last forever, right? Which is the CDU, which is the opposition party now, but that was Angela Merkel's party, which, she governed for 16 years. Then you have the coalition of the SDP, so the socialists, the FDP, the liberals, and the Greens. And the problem is the coalition is a disaster, and everyone's unhappy within the coalition, and the country's unhappy with the coalition. But it's not like the CDU is really the opposition. I mean, the CDU has been governing the country for 16 of the last 20 years, and a lot of the policies that are now sort of coming home to roost, whether it's on energy, whether it's our relations with Russia, you name it, the seeds of those were actually done during the CDU control. So you have a situation where the opposition is the AfD, where those that are sort of saying this is a total mess and a total disaster, we need like real change, are coming from the AfD, and now also this sort of lefty conservative upstart party, which is very sort of pro-Russian, anti-immigrant, yet trying to steal, yet sort of pro-worker, kind of a Marxist fashion. So that I think is the fundamental problem. The one thing that sort of gives me some hope is when I look ahead at the German elections, I do think that once you get these sort of political parties, particularly in coalition, unshackled from the coalition, they are going to rip the coalition and I think really try to differentiate themselves. But it's currently a real political challenge. And I also would be sort of concerned if I was the CDU, because Friedrich Merz is really pulling ahead. It looks like he's going to be the next chancellor. But if he wins, who's he going to govern with? And there really needs to be like a second major party. So either the SPD or the Greens or the FDP need to emerge as kind of an ascendant party. I can't really see it with the FDP, frankly, because Christian Lindner, who is opposed to all spending and loves the debt brake, which is now an economic albatross around Germany's neck, I just saw completely coming out strongly against migration and immigration, which, okay, fine from a political point.
But that means
your party's the Liberal Party.
That means the FDP's platform is the CDU's platform.
Right.
So he has no leg to stand on.
Right. It feels very vacuous, while on the other hand being very ideologically hardline when it comes to economics. It just doesn't really feel fit for the moment. The Greens...
They've tried this before with CDU.
Yeah. The Greens, I think they're the party that once unshackled will really rip the coalition and try to sort of reestablish themselves as really articulating a new line. But Robert Habeck, who is now going to be their chancellor candidate most likely, he was pushing everyone to get rid of gas boilers, or so the right-wing press in Germany sort of described it as. And then you have Scholz, who I don't think we should underestimate politically and could sort of revive the SPD, but then does the SPD want to enter into government with the CDU again? So
yeah, but Scholz comes out of this quite wounded as well. His image is really, really hurt at this point.
Very wounded. I think as a leader that really hasn't set a direction, and I think the coalition is part of that, but also that is part of like Scholz himself. So I think the danger is that you have a CDU AfD with the CDU trying to struggle with its cordon sanitaire around not cooperating with the AfD, and it's uncertain in these regional elections. How do you create a working governing majority if you're not going to work with the party that won the most votes in the AfD, or the second most votes, or the left conservative party that the CDU also disagrees with? So political mess in Germany. And that could have real implications maybe to our final topic, which is the EU and what I think is actually a very exciting period right now in Brussels. What's going on in Brussels?
At time of recording, we're waiting for Ursula von der Leyen's cabinet announcement. So the College of Commissioners, and that is 26 positions separate from hers. Each member state gets one commissioner. That's kind of the Super Bowl of EU positions, because some portfolios are a little less important, we'll be honest, but some are really important. And member states are vying to get the big ones because we're at an inflection point in the European Union on defense, on economic competitiveness. We'll talk to Federico about the Draghi report about competitiveness and making sure that the EU is on a sustainable economic path, because growth has been just really laggard. So she's building basically her team of Avengers to push forward really important policy files, potentially a lot of big reforms as well, if she can make that work. But she has to juggle a lot of things. We've talked about top jobs before, but just as a brief reminder, There's geographical diversity, there's gender diversity. You need to also make sure that someone who's coming into the portfolio has some vague inkling of what they're about to cover, ideally understand the EU institutions just a little bit as well, and have the clout to push forward big files.
Maybe just to put this in sort of clearer context for some of the American listeners. I mean, this is what happens between presidential election, after an election, who's going to be in the cabinet, except it's as if like Hawaii got to put forth like who is going to be their cabinet member, and you put that person as like SecDef or as the head of the Department of Education. In this case, there's far more agencies and far more departments because they had to invent some in order to meet the requirements of having every country being represented. But it's a lot of political jockeying happening right now.
Yes. And a lot of portfolios are set, but they can be changed. So we've talked a lot about this idea of a defense commissioner, for example, and changing the trade portfolio, making it a little less important so that the budget one is a lot more important because there's a lot of questions around investments coming in the next few years. So there's important figures to put forward there. I'll just say, I think it's important also to remember that she's probably also going to try to put some, let's say, problem children commissioners in portfolios that are less problematic. We've seen, like the Hungarian Commission of Arheli has been at enlargement for the last however many years. We've seen where that stands at the time where there's a lot of conversations around Ukraine joining the European Union, moving forward on the Balkans. Finally, there needs to be someone who can really have that impulse, and she has a lot of calculations to do there. And important is she can't just name them. They have to be approved by the parliament. So we're about to see not just a really important list of names, but also a ton of political jockeying in the parliament, because there will be hearings for each commissioner. And the parliament has killed nominations like this before. And the balance of power has changed.
Yeah. Maybe to just take a step back, I mean, the way I sort of see this is that it's not simply, right now there's a lot of jockeying over positions, but what's also happening is figuring out what's the plan? What's the governing agenda? This whole election cycle works different than American elections, although sometimes our presidential elections are not the most substantive. But what we just saw this week was Mario Draghi, who came out with this big report, long-awaited report on European competitiveness. And it's really an astonishing document. And what I think is really significant about this is it strikes me not simply as, an economist went off and sort of thought deep thoughts about like the future of the EU's economy and threw out some bold reforms that will never happen or bold proposals that will sort of never happen. This strikes me really as a governing agenda. It strikes me as sort of Project 2025 for the EU. In that sense.
But different content.
Different content.
To be clear.
Because what's in there is something that each of these portfolios, these new commissioners can pick up, and the European Parliament, and this can form the basis of future legislation. And embedded in it is sort of a bold new economic strategy for the EU. And the fact that it was sort of unveiled in a press conference in Brussels in September, middle of September, but with von der Leyen sort of really hugging it, I think is really impactful. And maybe just another thought about this commission is that we know who the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, that's Kaja Kallas, an Eastern European, someone who speaks very boldly and strongly about Russia, a bold voice. I think this is a commission that is going to come forth with some big ideas and going to be very bold. I think von der Leyen feels empowered, was re-elected or reappointed with quite a strong support, actually, in the end. Despite the fears of the far right gaining European parliamentary elections, it looks like the European Parliament has a clear governing majority to support a lot of the bold things on climate, investment, other things. The big obstacles are going to be, can you move Berlin to support some of these topics and maybe some other countries as well? But if I had to bet, I would say we look back 5 years from now and say, this was, I think, a really impactful commission. At least the way I see it now, it's being set up to be.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll be looking for also in these announcements is, since we're talking bigger picture, and you mentioned Kaja Kallas, is there a shift in the balance of power with the commissioners coming from Central and Eastern Europe? Which kind of portfolios are they going to get? Because we've talked a lot about Poland now being in a reinvigorated role. I think that'll be really interesting to look at as well. It's like, in this crucial institution, is Eastern Europe going to rise to the challenge? And is it finally going to be given more decision power?
Yeah. And a final thought on that. I think there's been a lot of talk about power shifting eastward in Europe. And that's oftentimes greeted in the United States of like, okay, we need to engage these states more. And I think that's true. But really, what does power shifting east mean? Well, power shifting east within Brussels. So right now you have a new Polish government, pro-EU with Donald Tusk. You have Kaja Kallas. There's an opportunity for Eastern Europe to more proactively shape the EU agenda. And I think that's the power shifting east. It's within the EU at Brussels. And I think that sort of past network of frugals that we saw since the 2008 financial crisis really emerged to block EU action. To me, I think that's fractured. And states like Germany and maybe the Netherlands are going to be somewhat isolated when it comes to opposing sort of big ideas to ramp the European economy, because I think there's clear that bold action is needed. And I think with that, that's a great segue to actually get in the weeds in the details of the Draghi report with Federico Steinberg. We are joined with Federico Steinberg. Federico, of course, is a familiar guest here on the Europhile. He's a resident visiting fellow here at CSIS, and he is also with the Elcano Institute. Federico is an economist and sort of the perfect person to talk to about the Draghi report, which has just come out from the former Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi and former head of the European Central Bank. Federico, this seems like a really big deal, this report, at least as I see it. It was released in Monday morning in Brussels in the middle of September, at the beginning of a new commission cycle, with von der Leyen just sort of being reappointed for a second term. And it's an incredibly detailed 400-page report that, to me, at least looks like a governing agenda. I'm curious how you see the report and its significance, and then maybe react to that, and we can get into the weeds of the report somewhat.
Sure. Thank you for having me here at the podcast again. And you're right. I mean, Draghi is a huge political figure in the European Union. Basically, he saved the euro in 2012 by, these famous words, do whatever it takes to save the euro. And then he went on to be Prime Minister of Italy. And he's a well-respected figure, therefore, particularly economic issues. And here the main problem is that the EU is lagging behind in terms of productivity, income per capita vis-a-vis the US, innovation, the problems of adapting to the new economic reality. And Draghi had been giving some speeches in the last years talking about the need for a radical change. Basically, the European Commission asked him to do this report more than 6 months ago. Basically, it was about competitiveness, but as you said, it covers a wide range of issues, and it goes to defense, economic security, the ways of financing that. We'll talk about it in a minute. And this is complementary also to the Letta report on the single market, the reform of the single market. Letta, another Italian former prime minister, who got this mandate from the European Council. So we have these two reports, but you're totally right. The importance of this report is basically that Mario Draghi, who's been everywhere in the European Union institutions, is sending a number of very clear messages to the political elites to do things. And as we'll discuss, many of the content has been under discussion for several months, I would say. Actually, we published a nice paper at CSIS, Europe Fiscal Crossroads, where we basically follow the same structure, right? Challenges, need for financing, sectors, what to do. But I think, therefore, that this is going to have an important impact. And the problems are going to be within member states, basically, because the report argues for a big push in European integration, common financing, etc., etc.
As you just said, the report argues for a range of changes, a range of issues. Just for our listeners' awareness, the three big areas that at least the forward presents to try to bucket things is the innovation gap, decarbonization and competitiveness, and increasing security and decreasing dependencies. That's a pretty tall order, which is probably why the report is 400 pages. But it comes at a very particular time, which we can take this in order. I definitely want to hear from you on those three buckets of work. What are the big recommendations that the report puts forward? And are they as ambitious as we expected them to be when we thought the report was going to come in June? And at the same time, I also would be really curious for your take about how it's being received, because some of these changes, we're wondering, does it require a treaty change? Are some member states going to balk completely? And is that a report that is therefore going to be completely shelved now that it's been released?
Yes, absolutely. For many of us that we like the European project, we all hope that these recommendations will be taken seriously, of course. And the report does a very good job in combining, the urgencies of the international political scene, which is basically the big external shock that the EU is having to try to rethink many of its policies. Because remember that the EU was basically a project that was looking inside Europe. It was about peace, integration, but not very much about what was going on in the rest of the world. So the report starts with a diagnosis, which is well known here in Washington, about the crisis of multilateralism, of the liberal economic order, of the trusted institutions, the great power rivalries, and goes very fast to argue that in these elements, Europe is finding it difficult to adapt. On the technological side, the big message is, of course, the EU is lagging behind in innovation, but it has an optimistic take in parts of the report about the technologies in which the EU still has not lost basically ground. And he encourages big investments on those areas, whereas maybe in others, you just have to accept that the EU has lagged behind. Basically, there's an issue of artificial intelligence, but for instance, the traditional industrial capacity of Europe is there. He argues that it needs to be re-examined to ensure that industrial policy, technological policy, environmental policy, and also foreign security policy and defense are more integrated. And then there's a big message on financing throughout the report. And here, again, the big discussion is about how far can you go and how the member states are going to receive it. Basically, he is not shy here. He has been arguing for basically the need for Eurobonds. He starts with this very clear idea. The EU benefited for many years from cheap energy from Russia, exports to China that made countries like Germany prosperous, and the security umbrella of the United States. This can no longer be taken for granted, any of these three, clearly not Russian gas, problems with China. Let's see what happens with the transatlantic relationship. So here he argues for a clear need to reduce energy costs in Europe, which is a basic input for everything else. And then we can talk about more the climate and the security. But the other key element is that there is a need to finance some European public goods. So this would be infrastructures, energy grids, a common policy, the clean tech sector, innovation and technology in key sectors, and also things that have to do with economic security. And for that, you are going to need common financing at the European level, because if you don't do that, you are going to be benefiting some countries over others, the ones that have more fiscal capacity. But also he makes the point that we also need to revisit competition policy in the European Union. And this is kind of very, very radical coming from him, because this has been one of the things that many member states don't want to get into this, right? The idea is that you have a level playing field, you have the state aid rules system, you have to ensure competition and not necessarily create European champions. And here the idea is maybe we have to rethink this and create European champions by promoting cross-country mergers of companies to have companies as large as those in the US or in China and to leverage on the single market. That's also quite radical, I would say.
On that, he's quite critical of Germany and France. They've gotten some exceptions to provide state support to their own domestic industries. But then, of course, if you don't have that same fiscal capacity, say, as Germany, if you're Spain or another Slovenia, you can't necessarily do that to the same degree. I think that criticism is particularly interesting, particularly of how things have gone in the last few years. I mean, the other aspect of this is really pointing to the lack of a declining amount of investment going into the European economies. And both from private sources that he points out that after the 2008 economic crash, that private investment really rebounded in the United States much faster than it did in Europe. And that there was such focus, I think, on limiting spending on sort of austerity policies that Europe sort of developed these surpluses, but now has underinvested. And if you look at the German rail infrastructure and other things like that, there's a real sense of lack of investment. And he talks about mobilizing money and creating a European safe asset. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Has that become sort of par for the course? Everyone sort of understands that's the case? Or does this represent kind of a new way of thinking about the European economy? Or is it charting a new course here economically for Europe?
This case for common financing and common risk-free asset has been discussed widely in technocratic economic circles in Brussels and in Frankfurt for a long time. It has political problems. From an economics perspective, it makes perfect sense, right? So basically here the idea is you have a number of things you need to finance, and you can think about the history of the United States, right? So over time, you have things that you have to pay for, and then you create a federal instrument to be able to finance that federal debt. You don't go state by state looking at who has more savings or not, right? So here we're in the same situation. The European budget is very small, this 1% of GDP, and basically the investment needs for the EU have been calculated by the report at around 5% of European GDP. So you would need basically around $800 billion per year of investment, or 4 points more of GDP on a European budget or something similar, right? By the way, this is more or less the figure you and I came out with in this report. So everybody's talking about same numbers. It's a huge increase, but it's perfectly doable, right? Now, how do you finance that? Well, basically, you can issue common debt, as was done with the Next Generation EU funds. You could have more contributions from member states to the European budget, or you can have European taxes, right? Green taxes, or a financial transaction tax, or transfer part of VAT, anything you want to put in the center. And that would make it more coherent. That would eliminate the problem you mentioned between countries that have more money and others that have less, Germany versus Italy, for example. And then the issue of the risk-free asset, for him is very important because he was conducting monetary policy. It's a bit technical, but basically here the idea is that in international financial markets, you have the US Treasury bill. That's the key asset of the world financial system, and that's considered a risk-free asset because the US is not going to default, right? It has other issues with the debt ceiling, etc., but basically it has the money to pay back. In Europe, you have German bonds, French bonds, Italian bonds, Spanish bonds with different ratings, and it's a bit complex, and it would be much better to have a European bond. Actually, that would allow the international role of the euro to grow as well. And that also would be very functional in terms of the conduct of monetary policy, which is something Draghi likes a lot. So basically, that's the technocratic part. It makes perfect sense. Now the problem comes with, okay, Germany, are you willing to accept more joint debt, more money in common, more contributions to the budget? And that's where things become a bit more complicated.
That gets to sort of the political problem, which you sort of skirted over to some degree, that this sort of cuts against where Berlin has been historically very opposed to sort of common joint debt, but not just Berlin. I'm looking at our producer Otto from Denmark, the quote-unquote frugals. And so there's going to be a big political fight here. I guess the one thought is that what may make this time sort of different is that you have maybe not an economic crisis in Germany, but a real need for an economic revamp or rethinking about what's the strategy here. And particularly in a world of more geopolitical competition, large industrial policy, especially here in the United States, but also in China, that there's kind of this need for Europe to also do something to ensure that its companies, that its economy is being invested in by a big state level entity, whether that's the member states or the EU. So maybe there is perhaps we're in a slightly different moment that you could probably make some headway. What do you think of the politics of this?
Yes, I agree with you that if there's a moment where this should move forward, it's probably now, right? So between the defense issues, defense spending needs of the member state, but basically of the EU, which needs to proceed. And the case in the Draghi report makes the case for some common, joint purchase of different things, from gas to military equipment, right? That also requires coordination, even if you're not going to have this big jump in the financing, or at least that member states coordinate. But yes, absolutely. You have a problem in which there's a clear recognition, and this was also in the Letta report, that the Europeans save a lot, but most of these savings end up in startups in London, in New York, in Silicon Valley, or in Tel Aviv, right? So this is basically a very well-diagnosed problem. And perhaps you need precisely to have this public investment and then the private sector will follow. That's the main idea. And this is an old idea in economic development, by the way. You put some money from the public sector and that has traction over the private sector. And I think the problem, and you mentioned this very well, in this context of the German government was really the finance minister, Linder, and the liberals' position. Germany is in a position of weakness, I would say, at this point. France, a bit less so, but let's see what happens with the new government, Michel Barnier. So yes, I think there's a window of opportunity, at least, to try to remove all these situations of, we stay with the status quo. We are not going to do anything different because the message is very clear. Now, then the details are going to be very complicated. And probably, as always in the European Union, we're going to see small steps that, if you look at them over time, basically can represent important changes, as we saw through COVID. But I don't expect, tomorrow the European Commission pushing for Eurobonds and the Council accepting them. Basically, again, we're going to have a big fight here between member states, some more than others, and then the more federalist European Commission that's going to start in November with a clear mandate to move forward these things.
I think a third option worth considering here is that there wouldn't be a political fight because everybody shoves the report away. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but I think it's something we need to consider. Von der Leyen has already talked about some of the ideas that are in the report as something that she wants to integrate. Other things are going to be really sensitive at a time where she's trying to manage a coalition that will vote her new commissioners that she'll announce. By the time that this podcast comes out, it will have been announced. So she has a very fragile coalition of political forces she needs to get together. The political orientation of all of these member states is going in all kinds of directions. So there could also be an option where everybody says, thank you, Mario. Super interesting. We'll talk to you in 5 years. I'm not saying that's important. That's what's going to happen, or that's preferable. It obviously isn't, because as we were saying, this is the time to make those big changes. I think a quote from him that is really relevant here is, we should abandon the illusion that only procrastination can preserve consensus. But that's the dilemma we're in, is at a time where the EU really, really needs to start putting down the steps that would improve economic sustainability and innovation, etc., is the hardest time for it to take those decisions because the member states just don't want to do it. So this is me just raining on everyone's parades, but it's something to consider.
You're right. I mean, if you look back the last 20 years, I remember, for example, the Lisbon strategy, 2000, that was going to make the European economy the most competitive and knowledge-based economy of the world by 2010. This, of course, ended up basically, I don't know where. But then you had the Monti report, another important Italian Europeanist, and those recommendations were taken a little bit more seriously. But yes, I agree there's going to be a strong tendency for, particularly von der Leyen, on some delicate aspects, especially in these first months, to leave that aside. And also we have to take into account that the report pushes very hard for deeper integration. You have the rise of extreme right populism, anti-European integration all across Europe. So this is going to be very tricky. But having said that, I think that the window of opportunity precisely comes from, for example, the emphasis on we need to cut energy cost. And for that, there are a number of proposals like decoupling the price of gas with the way you calculate electricity prices, some of the investments on the grid, some joint financing, and then he calls for an energy union. Well, I think that with the situation with Russia as it stands today, there's a clear case to move forward on that. And then finally, on the relationship, on the economic security, trade, and relationship with China, it's also interesting that the report takes a position that does not align with the US economic security strategy. For example, he says that it's interesting to take into account that in some areas where the European industry is lagging behind, maybe it's a good idea to have Chinese imports that are very cheap in sectors that at the end of the day, the Europeans are no longer going to be able to compete, because that would facilitate climate transition, whereas in others, like the electric vehicles, which is much more tricky, there's a full paragraph of recommendations. But overall, Draghi is an economist, and economists look at these issues with be very careful with decoupling. The cost of protection, neo-protectionism and neo-mercantilism are dangerous because you start putting a couple of tariffs here and there, and then you end up reducing the global pie of welfare.
On whether this report just is sort of a doorstop or actually gets implemented, I do think the political backing that von der Leyen has shown, I think, to the report is really impactful. And there's a lot in there that even if you have these kind of big fights over issues that need consensus, such as issuing new debt, expanding the EU budget, there's a lot that you can do legislatively that doesn't perhaps require the same consensus that will be passed through QMV, because this is, domestic and economic issues that I think will get implemented. We're going to see, I think this sort of provides a pretty clear governing agenda. Well, maybe just a couple quick thoughts on
defense industry side, because there's a really interesting chapter on this that sort of reflects and builds off of the EU defense industrial strategy. But there are some lines in there that are going to totally, raise the eyebrows of many in the American defense industry, because it really highlights that, like, the EU is shipping all this money abroad in buying foreign weapons when it could be producing more domestically. I think that makes a lot of sense. To me, the significance here is that it's Draghi writing this. It's an economist writing this. It's not just me or some other foreign defense policy wonk that has been in the weeds of the European Defense Fund or whatever other EU program. This is sort of breaking this issue out of the silo of the fact that European defense industrial landscape is completely fragmented, is a total disaster, and elevating that to economist level. And when economists look at it, they look at it very bluntly. And I think that is going to have an impact. Now, I don't think it's going to necessarily dramatically change things overnight, but I think it's another step to sort of mainstreaming that there has to be reform in this area that most politicians don't understand and just sort of defer to their defense ministries, who then speak at them with acronyms, and they sort of move on politically. So this has put this on the political agenda, and I think that means that the direction of travel is pretty clear here in Europeanizing defense. Maybe not as rapidly as suggested in this report, but I think that's coming.
Yes, I would agree. Going back to Donatia's question, there's no case for treaty reforms. We're not talking about that. But in defense, you can do many, many things before you get there. And also, defense is clearly intergovernmental, so it's basically out of that area. And it's member states coordinating. And also, all member states are increasing defense spending by themselves. So these strategies make sense, the coordination, the common purchases, etc. And also, the next commission is very likely that it's going to be, defense is going to be one of the key elements, just as climate change was the key issue in the previous commission. So I would be relatively optimistic on that as well.
Indeed. Well, Federico, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be paying close attention to what happens with this report.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Please also check out a new report from our program titled Power Plays, Europe's Response to the Energy Crisis, examining the energy shock caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's a fantastic report. It's a great overview of everything that's happened over the last few years in Europe when it comes to energy. You should check it out, and you can find a link to the report in the episode description. Our thanks to our producer, Sean Falk, and to Otto Svensson for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.